PoliticsNation. Joining me now is Congresswoman Jennifer McClellan, Democrat of Virginia. Thank you for being with us tonight, Congresswoman. And let me go right in at it. As we mentioned, Donald Trump is campaigning in your home state of Virginia tonight after an event in North Carolina earlier. Both sides holding Republican primaries this upcoming Super Tuesday. President Biden beat Trump in Virginia by more than 10 percentage points in 2020. But the latest polling out today from the New York Times and Siena College polls shows Biden trailing Trump by 5 points with registered voters and by 4 points with likely voters. Both numbers within the margin of error. What's your take on the race at this moment?
Well, I think that it is still early, and voters are just now starting to really tune in now that the likely lineup of Trump versus President Biden is in place. And as voters look at the president's record, as they look at the former president's record, and they're going to look at what's on the ballot. We have reproductive freedom on the ballot. We have our varied democracy on the ballot. And we have the president's need to finish the job of recovery. As you heard, we have a record recovery. We have over 14 million new jobs that have been created in the past 4 years. But there's still a lot to be done to build on the progress of the last 4 years and not take us back not only to the devastating times of the Trump administration, but he'd roll us even further back on climate action, on voting rights, on reproductive freedom, just to name a few issues.
Now, staying with Trump, there's a real concern now that he will not stand federal trial for his actions in the last election before the next election day is held. This after the conservative supermajority Supreme Court agreed to hear arguments over his claim of absolute presidential immunity in late April, leaving very little time for a trial before November. What's your reaction to what seems like a big win for Trump this week?
Well, you know, the court process will play out. I don't know that it necessarily will be a big win at the end of the day for him. And people are concerned about the likelihood that Trump broke the law, that he broke the law as trying to steal the election on January 6th. We already know that he has likely committed fraud and is under so many different indictments. And voters are paying attention to that, are concerned about that. I think, regardless of when the Supreme Court acts, people are paying attention to how dangerous Donald Trump is if he gets another 4 years in office.
Now, the Voting Rights Act legislation for the late John Lewis was just reintroduced by Senate Democrats ahead of the anniversary of Bloody Sunday tomorrow in Selma, Alabama. I'll be there, as always, to march across the Edmund Pettus Bridge, along with Vice President Kamala Harris and others. A new study from the Brennan Center out today finds the voter turnout gap between white and black Americans has increased since the Voting Rights Act was gutted by the Roberts Supreme Court in 2013, especially in those counties where histories of racial discrimination that were formerly subject to federal oversight. What more can be done to push back the erosion of basic democratic rights so many of us fought so hard to achieve in the first place?
Well, first, I would note that I am proud to be a co-sponsor of the House version of the John Lewis Act, which was introduced back in September by Terry Sewell. And I think about John Lewis all the time and his final words to us, where he said, democracy is not a state. It is an action that requires every generation to do its part. And your generation certainly did its part. My fathers, my grandfathers, my great-grandfathers. And now it's up to us.
Congresswoman, let me excuse you 1 minute, and I'll come right back to you. We're getting breaking news right now out of Missouri. NBC News is projecting that former President Donald Trump will be the winner of the Republican caucus in that state. We will have more on the details as we get into it just a moment. But let me go back to you, Congresswoman. You were answering my question on voting rights.
Absolutely. I mean, John Lewis said it's up to every generation to do its part to build our democracy, to save our democracy, to fight for our democracy. And now it's up to every generation to vote in this election like our very democracy depends on it. Republicans believe, the Voting Rights Act was bipartisan. Every time it was reauthorized, it was done so on a bipartisan basis. But since the Shelby decision gutting the Voting Rights Act, Republicans seem to believe the only way that they can win is by suppressing the vote. And we have seen a rash of voter suppression laws across the country, not just in the South, except here in Virginia, where we actually passed the Voting Rights Act. And that is the only way that Republicans feel that they can win, is by, bending the rules to suit their will. We need to come out and vote no matter the cost, because our very democracy depends on it. The progress that we built, on the civil rights movement is facing a backlash right now. And we have to make sure that we are vigilant to preserve our democracy, to preserve our progress that we've made on civil rights, on voting rights, on reproductive rights, and much, much more.
And in the last year, we've seen voting rights, Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act. We've seen affirmative action, women's right to choose, many of the rights that came out of the 60s and early 70s, gutted by this Supreme Court, 3 of whom Donald Trump nominated to be on the court. But let me go back to the politics. What are your thoughts about Missouri heavily going to Trump in this breaking news story I just read?
I'm not surprised. It has been clear that Donald Trump is the likely nominee. It is clear that he has taken over the Republican Party and about to put his daughter-in-law in charge at the RNC. So I'm not at all surprised by the result, but it makes crystal clear what is at stake in this election. This is going to be an election between, do you want another 4 years of Donald Trump that'll roll back progress on reproductive freedom, on voting rights, on civil rights, and on climate action? Or do you want to continue the progress that we've made under Joe Biden and Kamala Harris, rebuilding this economy, protecting reproductive freedom, protecting the right to vote, and protecting our very democracy?
Now, we mentioned the State of the Union coming 2 days after Super Tuesday. What do you think the American people need to hear from President Biden in that address?
I think he is going to talk about not only the progress that was made in the first 2 years, but how Republicans have blocked that progress and how we need to build on it and continue moving forward. He has done a record job on addressing climate change and bringing new jobs coming along with it. He has done a great job rebuilding this economy from the middle out and leaving no one behind. We've seen particularly growth in Black-owned businesses and small businesses around the country, just to name a few. So I think he's going to talk about the economic progress and the progress building back better, and how we still need to continue that progress going forward.
Thank you very much for being with us, Congresswoman Jennifer McClellan.